MIT has traditionally been known as a very apathetic school, and how exactly this relates to the emphasis on science here, I wouldn't want to go into. However, it's been very noticeable that over the past few years, I would say past 3 years, the active involvement of the MIT student body has been increasing.
I came to MIT in 72, and the fact that the Grateful Dead had been there in 70 was a big thing in the dorm.
There's the student center, and there's the plaza, and Bexley entry 50 over here. So people who are in the back of Bexley would wake up and look out on the plaza and see the Grateful Dead and say, what did I do last night? And then I'm hallucinating today. But sure enough, they were there.
When you came to Bexley as an undergraduate, they built two different types of things. First thing was everybody would build a heat kit amp. And that was a big part of the culture. In those days, there was a course 6-1, and there were actually people who built, electrical equipment.
If you built your own amp, and then built really big speakers too, that was very popular.
Music as part of physical dorm space wasn't the only tie to music that MIT's countercultural dorms had. There was also the Walker Memorial Basement radio station in close proximity to both East Campus and Senior House.
At the radio station, where I spent most of my time when I wasn't in class. That's probably where I spent most of my time, period. But yeah, that's where my primary sense of community came from. There was a late night program, midnight to 3 a.m., 5 nights a week, called The Ghetto, which was R&B music, and I started out working on the news portion of that. So we would put together a news broadcast, and I would read news. We would do music at parties. People would come out to parties and dance to the music. But we would go to some of the other venues, jazz clubs, art clubs, where national artists were performing, and bring them to the radio station for interviews after their shows. Before I got there was a concert, maybe 2 concerts with R&B groups. I know in 72 they brought in Mandrill, and I think even before that they brought in War to do concerts on campus.
The political turmoil of the late 70s and early 80s hit young people hard, and MIT students were no exception. The rise of punk and hardcore in major cities like New York and Los Angeles spread quickly to Boston, strongly influencing MIT's music culture just across the river.
Really kind of nascent. I mean, a lot of it happening in Boston. There were a couple individuals that went into Boston, but there weren't necessarily those shows and people that were interested. It hadn't started too much, and you really couldn't fully tell who they were.
Students didn't just listen to music, they also made it.
Was talking to Pat McGovern. He was learning to play lead guitar, right? I was a drummer. There was a third person on the floor, Joe, who was a bass player. So the three of us got together a couple of times, and there was a talent show in East Campus the spring of my sophomore year. I think it was the spring of my sophomore year. And so we played. We ended up winning, but by my understanding, it was a bit of a compromise win. We played a couple of Battle of the Bands. Like I said, we played a couple of Beast Roasts. Beast Roast was fun. Obviously, Beast Roast, well, maybe not, obviously. Bexley, just the physical placement of Bexley compared to the physical placement of Senior House and the amount of room they had available and stuff were very different.
Steer Roast, a 60-plus-year-old annual festival thrown by Senior House to celebrate all things debauchery, requires a fitting soundtrack.
When Steer Roast came, we all budgeted to put the president in a hotel for that weekend. The upperclassmen brought these bands in. The freshmen were told, you are going to love it. And I don't mean that in any kind of didactic fascist way, but it's you're going to love it.
There's no shortage of either pretty big name bands or really cool bands who came through Steer Roast and sort of shenanigans that some of them got up to.
Our friend Ted had a band, and Ted was a DJ at WMBR who arranged for Nirvana to come to campus. In return, his band got to open for Nirvana.
I've looked at old Steer Roast, the lineups, and there was always at least one house band on all those as well. Senior House had a band practice space in the basement where, people would play all hours. And so bands would come from Bexley or East Campus over to senior house in order to practice, because they also had a full set of equipment. The bands would just leave their drum kit there, and so there was space to do it, and no one complained, which is kind of how a lot of art happens.
With this giant speakers and mixing board that lived on the second floor lobby. And so basically, if you got home from class earliest, you could put whatever you wanted on them. The courtyard is enclosed, so you could hear it, but in order to talk about it, you had to walk into the space. The L-shaped nature of Senior House was incredibly conducive to it being both insular and open, and doing so through music as well.
So the layout of East Campus is different. It's a long hallway, and that allowed for more cohesiveness. Because the doors were open, it was more welcoming, so you could hear somebody's music. You could join in and just be there and listen. I had like a rack stereo system, which was at the time pretty impressive, especially for somebody of my gender and race. And that made me super popular on East Campus, and I didn't have that before.
As important as the spaces where people gathered were the amenities within. Rooms equipped with home-built stereo systems became integral social gathering grounds, a manifestation of MIT's maker and innovator culture. Additionally, the intrinsic tie between culture and technology at MIT easily facilitated the rise of a strong electronic music scene.
The reason why it had such influence is a lot of the early rave culture happened over the internet. Raves are organized via mailing lists and Usenet groups and things like that. So MIT people knew how to run that stuff. So I threw a rave as an undergrad, probably the first rave on MIT's campus. We actually capped it at 300 because we knew we didn't have the space for more than that. We had DJs come up from New York City to play. We had a jungle room and then a house room. It was pretty crazy. It was a little more than I was expecting.
I came here originally as house and hip-hop DJ. When it came to the parties, we'd be playing a lot more hip-hop and house music. It wasn't very complicated, nobody needed to know the song in order to dance to house. There's a bunch of college kids who want to dance, right? They want to blow off some steam at the end of a week of problem dance. We didn't really have modular synthesis. It was just we just want to bang something out really, really quickly.
All of it sounded like crap. None of it was good. But we were having fun.
It always felt like a special event when people actually played live electronic music. So it's we'll probably never hear this particular combination of sounds again.
Live music is very different than recorded music. And as a viewer, you're kind of you're watching your friends improve and get better. And I think most people thought it was fun to kind of to see their friends performing.
Creating the space for student and local band performances in EC was the next logical step.
I don't know how it happened, but one of us in the room just came up with an idea of getting these bands back together, and let's do something live. Let's do it in the East Campus courtyard.
Woke up in the morning.
The first one went pretty good.
I think the lineup for Fred Fest sort of came about before the fall 2008. From there, it was really just a question of how do we get all the logistical support for setting up a festival out in the courtyard, and that was probably the easiest thing and something of an afterthought.
East Campus was easy to manage. Close off both ends of the courtyard. There's a police detail at each end, and that was it. There was 1 year, and there was somebody on the Fifth West Hall yelling down saying something. A student came down. A student got on the stage, and Adam was asking him something about, is there what's going on? What are you yelling at? What are you screaming at? Nobody told him that this was going on. Adam asked him if he had any requests, and as silly as this sounds, the student's request was a John Denver song called Country Road. He pulled the plug out of the guitar. He walked into the crowd, and the crowd just kind of circled around him, and Adam sat cross-legged on the grass and played that song, and the students were all singing the song.
Before Fred Fest came into existence, the biggest sort of live events like that would have been really Steer Roast. I think a lot of the music-based events were just the regular hall parties that were happening. Hall parties were playing all sorts of music pop music, stuff coming from indie music, there was stuff coming from internet memes.
Meme songs have been a cultural staple in EC since early on. In 1962, residents wrote and published an East Campus songbook featuring songs like The Thermodynamics Final, God Bless Free Enterprise, I Want a Beer, and more. Many of those satirical songs from pre-2000 have been lost to time, but thankfully, with the dawn of the internet, some of the more creative songs have been preserved.
Do not report an emergency.
Roachquake, like a critical hit.
He was a hacker, boy. She said, see you later, boy.
But enough of the memes, let's get back on topic.
My first memories of Rush were showing up with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon playing, my mom being maybe a little hesitant when she came out and saw all of the construction that was happening in the courtyard.
Rex itself, there was just a lot of music going on. This is before Spotify had the web player session thing. I set up some server thing in my room and somehow hooked it up to Rush speakers and people could cue things. It would start early, the music would go late, and that would sort of set the tone in a certain sense. It's cool to be loud sort of vibe. An element of hardcoreness, an exterior shell, I feel, just putting a lot of noise out there, and some people, some freshmen might be a little intimidated, but I think once you get to know people, it's a pretty sort of sweet place. There's some fun creative parts, and there's a lot of just MIT bureaucracy, bullshit.
While the shutdown of Bexley in 2013 was due to structural concerns, the closure of Senior House as an undergraduate dorm in 2017 was certainly intentional. Citing low graduation rates and drug use in the dorm, MIT engaged in a failed attempt to reform Senior House's culture through a program called Pilot 2021.
Pilot 2021, we were what the fuck? And I remember dragging speakers and a cart to Lobby 7 and just making a bunch of us it's sort of impromptu organizing, making a lot of noise.
After over a year of back and forth between student leaders and administration, the dorm was closed. East Campus was an option for former house residents, but many ended up moving off campus, taking large portions of Senior House's storied culture with them. In the fall of 2023, East Campus was temporarily closed for 2 years of renovations, leading many residents to fear the loss of the countercultural residential system so integral to getting many through their undergrad years at MIT. Despite these worries, residents are doing their best to sustain East Campus's culture in anticipation of reopening in the fall of 2025.
I feel with EC being gone and the stud space being this thing on campus, we kind of lose that vibe of being able to hang out with each other at night.
I think it depends on who you ask.
I think it's a nice time for the community to get together.
Just as they did in the building, they serve to access certain parts of the community that can't be accessed through other types of events.
Without the actual building, I'm actually not seeing people from Flory or from Teddy Zoo unless it's at a party sometimes.
What got you into DJing?
I received a calling from God, actually, and they told me that you really gotta get on that.
A senior on Putz who lived across from me was blaring music really loud, and I walked into his room and he was on the deck, and I was like, do you want to do it? And I was like, okay. And he learned from a junior when he was a freshman, and it sort of got passed down.
Facilitating the passage of knowledge and information between freshmen and upperclassmen is even more critical during renovations. East Campus's temporary closure also gives an opportunity to reflect on music's role in our community.
There was very little judgment around music, dress, presentation, and I think that lack of judgment fostered important support systems, especially for people that were not like you.
So there's a little bit of creating identity around music as well. This is who we are, and our clothing tells you about that, our hair color tells you about that, but our music also tells you about that. So it's another way of signaling and being hey, come join us because we're like-minded.
Music isn't just a creative outlet, it's a vital element of our culture. While the ways we interact with music may change, the memories we create with it will stick around long past graduation.
So they just tore Bexley down, and it became, something that is the past. And I found that a little sad. So sometimes I go over where my entry was 48, And I like to stand under the spot where I know my entry was and look up and think about all the things that happened.
Maybe sometime